Our final guest is Mr. Dave Joe, also known as the Godfather. And Dave, I'm glad they played Papa Was a Rolling Stone. The fact that you have three of your daughters here today, it only bodes well that their father was a Rolling Stone. Woo! So anyways, and I think you, my friend, are afforded the last word as it should be. So Dave is a distinguished lawyer, an Order of Canada recipient, and one of the principal architects of the Umbrella Final Agreement. He has observed hardships, guided leadership, been on the front lines of Aboriginal rights in Canada, and has delivered a real change for Yukon First Nations. Dave is a citizen of the Champagne-Ajac First Nations, and he first became the First Nation citizen, or became the first First Nation citizen to become a lawyer. He has long served as a chief negotiator for the Council of Yukon First Nations and is still working as a legal advisor for First Nations in Yukon, British Columbia, and the Northwest Territories. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Dave Joe. Such a pleasure to have you on the show today, Dave, and always a pleasure to listen to not only your interpretation of what life was like back in the old days, let alone the journey that we have been on as Yukon First Nations ever since. So for the listeners who may not know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the journey that you're on?
Sure. I was born in Cluckshoe, Yukon, not all those many years ago, in 1949. And of course, thereafter, at age 7 in 1956, according to the Indian Act of the day, all Indian children, and indeed I was one back then, I had to attend residential school for the next 11 years, which of course I did. So I've done my time in that regard. And I came out, and prior to that, of course, I grew up with my family, living on the trap line for the first 7 years. So I grew up pretty much doing what Indians historically did: hunting, fishing, trapping, living on the land. They didn't live in one place. We had a trap line in Braeburn. We lived there over the winter months. We also had one at Desdiash Lake, and that was our spring trap line. So we'd harvest and trap muskrats and beaver, of course, and we'd fish. We'd set our fish nets, and it was a great lifestyle. It was, and in the summer, we moved to Cluckshoe, where we put up our fish, our salmon, our sockeye and king salmon, and it was a great lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And of course, I was born into the Wolf clan of Champagne-Ajac. My First Nation name, I was given the honor of being named after my uncle Dave Hume. So I got the name Dake. And as part of my Tlingit background, I am part Tlingit, Peter. That's where I get my wild side from.
And your look.
And it's and it's Duckloetti, yes. So that's essentially my background, and I met Elijah Smith back in the day, of course. I knew who he was. He was pretty famous. He became the chief of Kwantlen Dun about 1966, 67, and I met him shortly thereafter, and more formally, I guess, in the summer of 69. And I was sleeping on a couch maybe about this size in his cabin on the local reserve down here. I was out on a party. Can I say that here? It's safe to say that here. With his sons, Mike and Dennis Smith. And of course, they got the back room and wanted their own privacy. So I slept on the couch, and Chief Smith woke me up and asked me about what my plans were. I'm going, well, to get some water because I was pretty dry, and continue working as I did on construction. And the summer before, I worked in a mining camp. And it was good money in construction and working in mines, and I was planning to do that again. And he said to me, have you ever thought about working for our people? And I had to confess, no. And so he said, I will make you some steak and eggs, moose steak and eggs. How does that sound? And I thought, wow, that sounds pretty good. But he said, the deal is you got to listen to me. Listen to me while you're having your steak and eggs. So he did cook up some steak and eggs, and I listened to him. And he told me about his proposal to pursue a settlement of sort of land claims. He had friends in the state of Alaska, like Judson Brown from around Juneau and Klukwan. And so they were seeking a settlement as well. As most of you know, in 1965, the Tlingit Haida won their court case in federal court there. And they got a settlement. It wasn't a huge amount of cash, but they got about $7 million. And it was all premised upon a native title. And so Chief Smith, of course, knew that. And but rather than pursuing a court case here, he wanted to pursue like a land claim settlement to reinitiate the treaty-making process in a modern context. And that was sort of his vision. And he said, but I can't do it alone. I need some help. Would you be willing to help me? And of course, back then, I thought, sure, but how do I do that? Like, are you going to pay me? I knew that he didn't have any cash back then. He said, no, but I got a job for you. So I said, job, okay. What's the job? And he said, sports coordinator at Skookum Gym Hall. I'm going, what? You just told me about this dream of land claims and you want me to be a sports coordinator at a Skookum Gym Hall. So he said, that's your day job. Your real job and your nighttime job is to help me organize or assist me and others, of course, in the pursuit of land claims. Mm-hmm. So I agreed, and that was, I guess, my initiation into the process. And I recall looking after the Little League teams and structuring when they played and against whom. And I also coached the young men's team, boys team, from Kwanlin Dun as part of the league. And Skookum Gym had an old Volkswagen bus. And I had to go down, and I think the bus was given to Skookum Gym by John Hoyt. I don't know where John found this old bus from, but it was the most gutless Volkswagen bus that I ever saw. But I took it from Skookum Gym Hall because we had to play a ball game up at Takini, as I recall, fastball. So on the way up, and I was always down in like first gear going up 2 Mile Hill. And I was afraid with about 12 kids, 12-year-old kids in the van, we'd be barely making it up 2 Mile Hill. And there was always one boy that would say, Coach, you want us to get out and push? And I said, no, please don't do that. Thereafter I worked with Chief Smith, and so that was sort of my beginning in the process, and certainly worked with people like Judy with YNB back in the day, and she was the secretary treasurer back then, and a very good one at that, as I recall.
Awesome. Just in regards to Elijah's experience, and obviously served for us in the World War, Second World War, where do you think he got his inspiration or his vision from, if you will, when it comes to developing where we are today, but just even the motivation behind it?
Well, I spent a lot of time, we traveled around the Yukon, basically trying to, I guess, spread the gospel of land claim. Mm-hmm. And we shared tents wherever we sort of camped at, and so we traveled around. And I asked him, during his war experience, what was that like? And he said, I did fight over there. I was, in fact, wounded, and was doing time at a hospital in Paris when the war came to an end. And he said there was no one in the hospital because most of the people were out in the streets saying, yay, the war is over, sort of thing. He said there was just me and this nurse, and so they went out and watched it. But he did explain while he was doing the service that he was treated just like an average person. He had the rights to go in the bars, which apparently was important to him, and certainly important to me now, and to enjoy all of the rights that a normal citizen would have. And when he came back to Canada, though, he did not have the right to vote, couldn't go in the bars, could not own land, could not hire a lawyer for the purpose of advancing a land claim, could not talk about advancing a land claim. And I think the comparison of the degree of equality that he was treated with, the degree of acceptance when he was in the army, and the contrast to when he came home. And most returning vets were entitled to a quarter section of land under the Veteran Lands Act, except for Indians. And so he had applied for some land at 945 out at Tekeener, as he calls it, and they told him no. And he said, why not? And they said, because you're Indian. So I think that sort of comparator in terms of being accepted as an equal, and then coming back to the country that he basically enlisted for, to fight for the values of Canada, but being denied those basic values, essentially ticked him off, I think, to a point in which he said, I came back here, was not treated fairly, and he did say, and I got drunk for about 20 years and decided to sober up because it was not helping me, it wasn't helping us. And once he achieved that degree of sobriety, he had this vision and this quest, and he adopted that, and he remained committed to that vision and that quest, and begin to initiate a process to remove all the barriers that were in place through laws of Canada, and thank God for that. But unfortunate for him and those of us who faced all of those laws that were based upon race, and now removed in the Yukon, thank God, in large part at least. Thank God for his vision in that regard. And I think that's what sort of propelled him to make those changes.
Yes, and I appreciate that. And then Elder James mentioned yesterday just the relationships that were built through the residential school or through the mission schools that they're referred to as well. How important were those relationships to you as an individual going through the process, let alone the benefit of having those relationships as we entered into the land claim process?
Oh, they were very important. Of course, I knew Harry Ellen. We grew up in Pluxew. I got to meet people like Mike Smith, who became a mentor of mine, and James Allen. I met James there, and those friendships developed through that school system, such as it was. I think were important because it formed an allegiance that was important. We understood what our respective backgrounds were. And those friendships, between Judy and Adeline, were initially formed in large part at those schools. And they formed like a commitment and understanding of support. And they were really super important because you trusted them. They basically had your back at school. And we played all of the sports. We played ball, we played hockey, we played on the same hockey teams. We knew that throughout those sports that we had their support and their friendship and their confidence in us. So they were very important.
So when you talk about the past in regards to that, even things such as the Native Hockey Tournament was formed because of those relationships, but more importantly, we weren't allowed to participate, if you will, in the general public. Can you talk about what it was like as a young person growing up in your own territory, being excluded, let alone, government policy restricting you to have any progress, let alone having a right?
Yeah, that part was hard. The only sort of teams that we were allowed to play on were sort of our own Indian teams, which was not a bad thing because we had pretty good Indian hockey players, and we dominated basically the hockey leagues here in town. Much to the chagrin of the rest of the hockey teams, but at some point in time they complained, and they basically said these Indian teams are too strong, and we should divide some of the teams up a bit. So at that point in time, because I guess we were so darn good that they felt that was necessary to separate us for the purpose of hockey and basketball and baseball and all those other sports. But certainly those bars that were in place, we certainly felt them. But I think people, generally speaking, appreciate good talent. And we had many good, talented hockey players and sports people that are indeed still very good, like Margaret Commodore, who is a great superhero playing fastball. So, yeah.
So as we celebrate 50 years of Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow as an organization, primarily as CYFN and CYI, we've gone through many challenges, if you will. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in 1984? Because I think that was a pivotal change not only in your career as well, but obviously not accepting the settlement or the agreement, I should say, that was brought to the table at that time. What was your perspective from 1984, if we can go there?
Well, my perspective is that when you're trying to work out an agreement as complicated as the land claim agreement, and you've got three parties, Canada, Yukon, and Yukon First Nations, you all have separate mandates, right? And when the mandate of one party, in this case Canada, was about to terminate, they want to close the agreement under their existing mandate. And they know that their mandate comes from the electorate. And so they put a lot of pressure on CYI to close the deal so they could get a feather in their cap going forward. And so as a person that was employed by the chiefs and by the executive, I had to take instructions, and my instructions were to try to work out an agreement in the context of the existing mandates that we had. And I knew that some of the mandates that I had been instructed with would not fit into the mandates of Canada. And I advised my bosses that I think this is going to be a problem. This is going to be a huge problem because there's resistance to the concept of extinguishment. There's resistance to going forward without an agreement on self-government. There's a resistance to going forward without some degree of access to subsistence harvesting. And those were the big three. And they said, be that as it may, we want to close this agreement out. And sure enough, there was backlash that was felt, and new instructions granted after the Conservatives won the election in '85 nationally. And all of the big issues that the previous government did not embrace as part of their mandate, like self-government. They said, yeah, we could talk about that now. Can we change the extinguishment policy of Canada that had existed since the first treaties in Canada until we came along? And they said, yeah, we think we can talk about that. We can establish the Cooligan Task Force report from '85, '86, and look at other options as to how to get a settlement without the extinguishment of rights, titles, and interest in the context of that. And yes, we can talk about subsistence. And all of those were before the Sparrow case of 1990 from the Supreme Court of Canada. And so those mandates changed. And of course, we embrace those changes. And but the rejection within the mandating process of the '84 sort of collective mandates were not accepted due to those big three. And we did manage to change all of them thereafter.
For sure. And you talk about extinguishment. Weren't our rights extinguished in 1876 through the Indian Act?
No, they were not.
Okay.
They were, we weren't allowed to do certain things, like we weren't allowed to gather for the purpose of dancing or singing. Under 1884, under the Potlatch laws, we weren't allowed to have potlatches. We weren't allowed, of course, to do a number of things like retain legal counsel. We weren't allowed to own land. And all of those were lifted in 1951. So there were a lot of statutory bars that were lifted. And indeed, now with the Constitution Act of Canada in 1982, and all of those constitutional changes we did participate in as well. So we were multitasking. Not only were we talking about, like, what do we do in the construct of a modern land claim, We also participated in 2 pipeline hearings. I see Ron Vales out in the crowd. He was our legal counsel for the Berger pipeline inquiry. And we also participated in constitutional conferences prior to 1982. Like, we had to lobby hard to get the inclusion of Section 35 in the Constitution Act of Canada. And thereafter, Section 25 to protect any treaty rights not to be affected by the Charter. And so all of those were very important, and we managed to do all of that. And I must confess, in a very fruitful and not in a shy way either.
For sure. And one thing I really appreciate you, Dave, is your willingness not only to share your experiences and stories. One of the favorite ones I have is when you sent Ray Jackson to Ottawa, not only to immobilize the team, but also to set presence, a sense of presence in Ottawa. Can you tell us a little bit about what the objective of having a face in Ottawa, let alone that ability to navigate through the city at that time?
Well, it is a short and a long story. I'll tell the longer sort of version of the story. When the Alaskans, our friends in Alaska, all of their rights, titles, and interests were expropriated by an act of Congress in 1971. And we went over and stayed 2 weeks in Anchorage, Alaska, at the lovely Mush Inn in Anchorage. And we asked them about what their experience was, and they gave us advice. They said, our advice to you folks in the Yukon, if you're going to pursue a treaty, is to get out there and lobby. You could never get enough of that. So we took their advice, and we got an office on Slater Street in downtown Ottawa. 151 Slater, as I recall, our office. And we hired Ray Jackson, who was our former chief. And so he did take care of the office. He had office staff there. So we always had a continual presence there back east. And Ray is a very great guy. He was the original CFO for YNB for us. Like, we didn't have lots of cash, but he took care of all of our cash for us. And so we sent him back there. But we came in one time, we brought all of our chiefs in, and we had a boardroom in that office space, and we were part of a big, extensive lobby. I forget what bill, C-48 or something. And we came in, and there was someone else occupying our office space. And we're going, this is kind of strange. So I walked in, and the people that were there were saying, who are you? We're going, well, we own this office space. And they said, no, we do. We signed a sublease with Ray. So Ray was doing a bit of a side agreement that we weren't aware of. So we said, no, Ray's got no authority. This is ours. So get the heck out of our office, which they did eventually after. But Ray was instrumental in ensuring that we had ongoing contact with all of the MPs and with Parliament and with the Senate. But that's just
a little tidbit.
Part of the story of the process.
For sure. And you had the privilege, along with Judy, to travel with the chiefs. What What benefit, from your perspective, having those men, if you will, bring their presence not only from a traditional aspect, as we talked, a lot of people were just straight off the trap line coming right to the downtown Ottawa reality. How important it was for our people to have that traditional aspect, their culture, their language, their knowledge of where they've come, obviously over the last 11,000 years of our existence, if you will, to have that presence in a totally different reality when it comes down to, where we are today in the public government. How important was it for us to bring that perspective from our traditional aspects into the modern society?
Oh, that was hugely important. Initially, when we went out, basically all of the chiefs were trappers. I think the only one that may have had like a year-round full-time job or a good job was Percy Henry, who was working for YTG up on the Dempster Highway. The rest of them were all basically hunters and trappers, and they understood the importance of land. Mm-hmm. Without that perspective, they basically articulated the necessity of the rationale for land quantum, ensuring that self-government replicates their traditions, their customs through either a clan system like in Teslin and in Carcross, and reflects the moiety system, the wolf and crow for the other nations in the Yukon. And without that, sort of the models that we currently have for self-government would not have been successful and responsive to those cultural understandings and that background. So that was hugely important for us. And of course, they all spoke their own languages as well. And that was great. And they shared all of that with us. And of course, that was important as well.
For sure. And then we fast forward to 1989, and obviously there was a pivotal change for us once again with the agreement in principle. And nations such as mine, Teslin Clinka Council, once again went back to a traditional system of appointing the chief, and we appointed David Keenan outside of the electoral process. How important was 1989 to us as First Nations here in the territory?
Well, again, that was important because that's when we signed the agreement in principle. And the agreement in principle contained all of the things that were not part of the mandate or the policy of Canada back in '84. And so it represented a change of circumstances for us. And that constitutional reality or realities is that entrenchment, that degree of entrenchment of the constitutional powers that Yukon First Nations have in the Yukon has not been replicated anywhere else in modern treaties in the rest of Canada. So it is, and we always anticipated that that would become like the basement, and the other First Nations that came after in BC or elsewhere in Canada that did not have modern treaties would build upon that. And unfortunately, that had not happened. And we are totally supportive of those sharing those concepts and certainly building upon those concepts in a territorial and to the extent that they want to maintain that, but more importantly in a national context as well.
And if you're just tuning into Shone FM or Facebook Live, you are listening to the 50th anniversary speaker series, and we have the Godfather himself live on the couch. Just go back to a pivotal another time in our history, 1993, with the signatories of the Umbrella Final Agreement. Can you talk about what the 11th hour was like for us as First Nations? Because I talked to people such as Tim Kepke, who represented obviously the federal side. There was a lot of uncertainty still at the 11th hour for some nations. Can you talk about what the environment was like at the table, if you will, at that point?
Well, part of the agreement after we signed the agreement of principle in '89 big question was, what's the degree of support going forward from Yukon First Nations? And we reached an agreement or an understanding with Canada that we'd work out a common agreement, the UFA, and that we'd also, it's obvious we couldn't get all of the Yukon First Nations to the table, all 14, to have final agreements. So the question became, what's that threshold? And we agreed that we could have 4 of the Yukon First Nations that would be sufficient to carry forward the concepts that were embedded in the UFA as contained in their own final agreements. So we had 4 of the 14 going forward. And so a lot of that we had to push for, and we weren't certain that Canada would necessarily accept that as being a sufficient ratification for the concepts in the UFA and for the concepts in the respective final agreements for the 4 First Nations. So, but they generally had agreed, and once they had agreed, then they could pass their own laws in Parliament to enable both the final agreements and the agreements for self-government for those 4 as well.
Yeah. And so in regards to regional distribution or involvement, if you will, was it selected that we chose Teslin-Clinka Council, Champagne-Ajac, Vantaquichin, and Nacho-Nagdun for where they were located in the territory, or were they just willing to take that next step?
Well, that was part of the debating process. We basically said to the chiefs, to the Yukon First Nations, you're going to have to decide amongst yourselves which 4. And those 4 stepped up, and they basically said, we want to be, if the threshold is 4, to ratify the concepts in the UFA, we want to be those 4, and those 4 stepped up to the plate, and the rest of them agreed that they should go forward in that respect.
On a personal level, the legacy of obviously Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow will live on far beyond our time and presence on the planet here today. What does it mean to you, Dave, as an individual, the legacy of Together Today?
Well, I think the concepts that were built in, the simple concept of unity, we are stronger, and that it's not about those of us that are currently here, that it's a forward-looking document. And I think it reflects the cultural values that we're brought up with, that we leave our children a better place to live in. We give them better chances and circumstances that we had. And we leave the world, the environment in which we live, better than what we inherited from our parents, to the extent possible. And so I think the document and the statement contained in that document and the title itself, I think, conveys those simple principles. And I think that's certainly a foundational concept that will live, hopefully, in perpetuity.
We recently had the Prime Minister here on Sunday joining us, which I think is a very high sign of respect. He talked about that what we have in the territory here in the Yukon is what he wants for the rest of the Indigenous people in Canada. I think really looking realistically to the rest of the 606 nations that don't necessarily have an agreement, let alone a pot to piss in and a window to throw it out. Sorry to say that, but I mean, really, in reality, are nations in Canada going to have the ability to have what we have here in the territory, just based on your own thinking?
I hope so. However, if you take like the First Nations in BC, for example, you've got a province. You had a colonial government there from 1858 to 1871, and a province from 1871 to the current time. And I've worked with some of the First Nations in the province of BC, like amongst the Stalo, with the Tsleil-Waututh out of North Vancouver, and I currently still work in BC. And it's a slog to be able to rationalize the entrenchment of the exclusive constitutional powers that a province has, in which they basically say, under Section 109 of the Constitution Act, 1867 for Canada, we own the lands and resources within the province. We, the province, owns, not you Indians, not you First Nations. We own that. We have the exclusive jurisdiction over children in the province of BC, not First Nations over their own children under the guise of Section 35(1). I mean, those are struggles. And so we didn't have that in the Yukon because we did not have the entrenchment of constitutional powers in the government of Yukon. And I'm optimistic that that somehow, and there is a fair degree of flexibility now, they are beginning to realize that those hard and cold stances that normally are adopted by provinces are being, I guess, released to some extent in the province of BC, because they are considering like even the extinguishment policy that is embedded in our final agreements in the Yukon, they have agreed that there will be no extinguishment. Instead now, there's no need for it. Instead, it's a review process, and we could retain our title consistent with the terms of final agreements or treaties that are signed. And those are all positive statements going forward, but I think it would be a real challenge for them in the province of BC to get what we have reflected in the Yukon final and agreements of self-government here in the territory.
Because there's just been the compensation would be beyond their control as well, right? I mean, all the things, like you look at the Macmillan Bodells or Alcans of the world that have taken so much from their traditional territories, the compensation would be something they would not be able to uphold, I would think, right?
Yeah, because exactly. A lot of the, if you were to take something like the honor of the Crown, the duty of the Crown to consult and accommodate any rights that are retained by a First Nation. The courts have ruled those are prospective rights, which means you look forward with those rights. So to the extent that those companies did damage historically, which they have done, you don't look at what they did in the past. You only look forward to addressing any accommodation of the impacts that what they're doing as a company or companies in BC in this case, how to address that. But Canada now, I think, and the provinces are beginning to address those historical wrongs through like historical reconciliation agreements to realize that the common law is not sufficient to address like those historical wrongs that may have been committed by multinational corporations in the provinces, in the territories, etc. And indeed, I look forward to those changes, and I'm certain that the First Nations who live in those provinces also look forward to those changes, both in terms of policy, and hopefully the law will follow those changes in policy as well.
For sure. And just to wrap things up, Dave, what are some of the most important lessons we've learned in the past 50 years that are going to help support us on our journey for the next 50 years?
Wow. I think what we've learned for sure is that if we stick together, there is strength in unity. And we've also learned there is strength in our culture, that we should have pride in our culture, that there is strength in our languages, and there is potential, a huge amount of that in our young people and the succeeding generations that are to come. And I think the foundation that we have provided as sort of their elders, I am that one now, I must confess. It hurts to say that sometimes, Peter. But is sufficient to allow them, to give them the tools to basically carry on in the fashion that is consistent with our cultures and our values and our teachings, because they have maintained us historically as a people since time out of mind. And going forward, I'm confident that those same values, same principles that we've learned as children will carry them forward as well. And couple that with the constitutional tools that we've left them. I don't think we've precluded very many options for them. I've got every confidence that the young people, like my three daughters that are here, Nadia and Jessie and Jamie, will all have those opportunities going forward.
Oh, geez. Well, Dave, I just want to personally thank you for taking the time to join us today, but also for your unwavering spirit towards, not only sharing your stories, but also the support that you give us as young people today, because the mentorship is so important to where we're going, let alone to hear the stories of the trials and tribulations of our people. So we have a little token of our appreciation for your time today, but I just wanted to honor you with the final word, and I want to thank you very much for your time today. And as much as this is a celebration of all of our successes, you are definitely a pivotal part of this whole success for all of us. So, little cheesh, and we look forward to chatting further, and go Habs go.
Thank you.